Welcome to Vanguard, a podcast of radical traditionalism. Here's your host, Richard Spencer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Vanguard. With me, as always, are Colin Liddell and Andy Nowicki. How are you guys?
Fine, thanks.
Well, today we're going to talk about two disconnected matters, although perhaps we'll find some connections between them. The first is something that's quite timely. I guess both are quite timely, though in different ways. The first is quite timely, and that is the aftermath of the 2012 election. It's funny. I was actually just at the Making Club conference, and I was emceeing the first night, and I made this joke of, I've been traveling around a lot, going in and out of airports, which was quite true. And I said that I didn't, hear anything about what happened with the election or something. But, I had been watching Fox News incessantly for days before the election, and I was informed that we were about to achieve total Republican hegemony. And so I just assumed it was done. But of course, I think a lot of people came in for a massive shock. We can talk a little bit about that in terms of I can't believe the just disconnect between reality and wishes of Republicans. Then the second matter we're going to talk about is the new movie Skyfall and the whole James Bond mythos, which I think is worth talking about.
It's much more important than the U.S. election.
It is, in a way. I think it might tell us more about it. But anyway, I think some interesting things are happening as a result of the election. For any of those of you who actually don't know what happened, Barack Obama won. It was not a landslide by any means, but he won very comfortably. He took all the swing states that he needed to take. Interestingly, the voting was down. I believe, isn't this correct? Romney received less votes than John McCain, which is interesting. And there was people talked about a missing 6 or 8 million white male vote, and these are essentially people who are, I guess, not truly missing, but they did not come out to vote. They were so voting was suppressed. Yeah, and so this is all very important. And let me get the conversation started with something that I have noticed, and I noticed this immediately after the fact, is this open talk of race and demographics with regard to elections. And I'll mention this. Actually, on election night, our friends over at Russia Today invited me on to, at early morning Moscow time to comment about the election. And I kind of thought that I was being edgy talking about, demographics or destiny and, and racial voting patterns and blah, blah, blah. But in fact, I was probably being lame because everyone was talking about that. And, I also noticed along with this is this kind of, it's not just simply about demographics. There's almost a kind of we will crush you feel to a lot of the talk. It's kind of like, well, of course this happened because we've been doing all this mass immigration, all the time from the third world, and they vote Democratic, and, we like that. And, the country club, white people and the GOP, their days are numbered. Ha ha. I really had that element. I mean, in some ways people have used those exact words. So anyway, Andy, why don't you pick up on that? And Colin, I don't know if you've sensed this from your home base in Japan as well, but...
No, they haven't really focused on that much. But I have gleaned some of it from the internet.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's correct, and I should say last time we talked, I wasn't secure about it at all, and I said, don't, it's probably not. I'm probably not the one to listen to about these things anyway. But I did predict a Romney victory, and I was wrong, and you were right, Richard. So mea culpa there. But not terribly surprising in retrospect. Mm-hmm. But as far as the demographic question, yeah, I think that's definitely more out in the open, and there's more of a, as you say, we will crush you. Your days are numbered. Your people are dying. we're going to dominate in the future, and we're virtuous and you're evil, and so therefore we'll outlive you. It's like there's some hint of that, like, you know, the Republicans are dying out, white America is dying out because of its past sins or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean,
like
it's
right. It's not rational, but
yeah. But on the other hand, what I found kind of startling is there seems to be more frank talk about demographics from some conservatives as well, most notably from Richard, your close personal friend, Pat Buchanan. I know you've had him on a couple times on podcasts and stuff. And he supposedly did, I didn't hear this interview firsthand, but read about it afterwards. He did an interview with G. Gordon Liddy on the night after the election where he said some things that just didn't sound very much like the Pat Buchanan that I can remember, anyway, in the last few years. In its just frank racialism.
Wow.
He said to him, just listen. He said, I've got the quotes right here. He said, "White America died last night."
Wow.
This was the night after the election. Obama's reelection killed it. He said, our 200-year history as a Western nation is over. We're a socialist Latin American country right now. Venezuela without the oil. And
so the gloves are off.
Yeah, and then Liddy said, well, you're not saying that white people are better than other people, right?
Oh,
and then Buchanan said, of course that's what I'm saying. Anything worth doing on this earth was first done by white people. Who landed on the moon? White people. Who climbed Mount Everest? White people. Who invented the transistor? Who invented paper? White people. Who discovered algebra? White people. And he goes on.
Wait a minute. Is this a piss take? Because wasn't it the Chinese who invented paper? Or
yeah, it's probably. But
algebra is an Arabic word.
Hey, Colin, shut up! Don't get in the way of white supremacy.
Yeah, he's on a roll here. And then he said, and don't give me this nonsense about Martin Luther King and civil rights. Who do you think freed the slaves? Abraham Lincoln, a white guy.
No, it's the British Navy.
Again, this is Pat Buchanan, who is never, I mean, I know people have thought, especially liberals, have thought that, in his rhetoric, it's just code words for racialist talk, rhetoric. But this seems, again, very, very frank, very open, and it's startling. It was like I thought this couldn't be true. I thought there must have been some mistake. But
if Pat always
he actually said these things.
Yeah, if Pat always speaks in code, maybe this was code for something else we just don't understand. He's talking about agriculture. I mean. So
what do you make of that?
It's pretty amazing.
I think he's been a little bit maybe too pessimistic, and maybe that's just a reflection on the way his life in politics has gone, because everything he's always campaigned against has always happened.
Yeah.
Now he's obviously he's in the autumn and twilight years of his career. And so that just puts a very pessimistic cast on everything. So I think it's very natural for him to be talking like that, especially since he's kind of been booted out of the system as well.
Yeah. Maybe they think he has anything to lose now. I don't know.
Yeah,
but Richard, you know him, so I mean, or you sort of know him.
Yeah,
what do you?
I don't really know Pat. I mean, I've spoken to him a number of times, and I've been lucky to even see him at his house, and I'm friendly with him, but I don't really know Pat. I would not say that. I'm, like a lot of these major public figures, it often seems like they're always on. When I'm talking to him, it's almost like I'm interviewing him for a radio show or something. He's always in his performance mode. But in some ways, again, I think maybe we should offer some criticism of Pat in the sense of, and this goes along with Colin, is that Pat, despite the fact that he has been a truth teller, and despite the fact that he's been willing to take some very controversial positions, like on the Second World War and and all this kind of stuff. He still has he really thinks of himself as a Republican, and he has a great deal of loyalty still to the Republican Party, which is in a way kind of amazing. And, this is a guy, when he was my age, he was already he had already worked for a president, he was born in Washington, D.C. He, even though he came from a, patriotic Catholic parish, Blessed Sacrament, I believe it's called, he was still, he was part of it. And so I think maybe we could criticize him in saying that, listen, Pat, just because the stupid Republicans lost this election doesn't mean that Western civilization has ended. I mean, maybe it's the beginning of a new chapter. So I think we should probably, I don't think we should always just think in terms of politics. I don't think these different parties really pursue particularly different agendas, and and so I think we should maybe be a little bit skeptical of Pat, but I think at the very least,
we're sort of reaching the point where politics is becoming irrelevant and economics is going to take over.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, at least
and
politics,
human nature,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, at least politics in the way that it's defined as, issues, and you go to the polls every couple of years and vote. I mean, I think that is becoming irrelevant. I don't think they're major. I'm not sure a McCain term would have been radically different than an Obama term. I don't think they would have been that different at all. I think there probably would have even been some kind of health care bill.
I agree with that. I think, this kind of hysteria, like, oh no, wringing of your hands, oh no, the day after the election, that my guy didn't win, so therefore this is the end of everything.
Right.
That's the whole kind of rhetoric I was complaining about last time we talked that I just find so irritating. So that there's that aspect of it that of what Pat's saying here that I do think is worthy of criticism. But on the other hand, just this frank talk about white America and the accomplishments of whites through history, that's really something. That seems unprecedented.
Yeah, it is. And I think a lot more white people are really are thinking in this direction. And I also think there might be some pessimism. And I grant that this is totally anecdotal. But a good friend of mine who's another Washington operative, but he does think like us, he went to some party, and he was there with this girl whom he described as a kind of intelligent birther. She had gotten into law school or something, so she must be pretty smart. But then she also kind of was talking all this stuff that maybe strikes us as a little too W&D or World Net Daily kind of stuff. But anyway, she was smart, and she was basically saying, like, landslide. She was like, the American people have always rejected socialism, or something like this. And my friend was saying, I think Obama will win, but it's not a sure thing. She was like, oh, you don't understand, the people or something. And afterward, he was driving her home, and she was crying, and she uttered the phrase, "Please hold your ears if you're if this will offend you." She was crying. She uttered the phrase, "Fuck America." And, I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't take these parties too seriously, but they are symbolic for people. And maybe this is a kind of turning point with a lot of normal white people, where they think some of those thoughts that they didn't allow themselves to think just 2 years ago, that the country is against them, the country is not them, they're going to become a minority, their children are going to be live in something that's going to resemble some kind of strange version of a third world country. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being optimistic, but maybe this is a kind of turning point for them. And it's something we can only kind of glimpse anecdotally. When you meet that guy who otherwise would be a PC Republican, and then he's like, white America's dead, we need to secede. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I don't even know.
Yeah, white America might very well be dead, but the America that comes after it, how far will it actually get?
Well, what do you mean? Do you think it's just going to, it's just going to collapse? There are too many
Well, I mean, why America? You could see all sorts of reasons why it could progress as much as it did. In the face of all sorts of challenges. But the America that's now supposedly being created and rolled out there, obviously it doesn't. The prospects for it are not too good. So this was the whole thinking behind my article, Obama, Unwitting Savior of White America.
Yeah.
It's based on the idea that this new multiracial America, it sounds great, but how are you going to pay for it? And, how are you going to afford the bribes you need to pay to keep everybody living together harmoniously?
Right. Well, the short answer to that question is the dollar is still a reserve currency and that they can just print as many of them as they like. While taxing people, even though they, in a way, don't need to tax people.
Okay, well, that solves everything.
Well, but obviously that's a geopolitical structural arrangement, if you want to call it that won't last forever. I mean, it just simply won't.
Yeah, I mean, you could follow that path for a few years, but eventually, you're going to hit the wall, and when you do, you'll hit it a lot harder than you would otherwise.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just like how many years can you actually go down that path?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I don't even know what to think of it. I mean, I've thought about this a lot myself. I was just thinking about California and saying like a California with a major Hispanic majority, But then, so you have some places in the Southern California that resemble like hellish versions of Mexico, Mexico City, humongous sprawl, massive homelessness, cardboard box cities, blah blah blah, and then you have gangs, warfare. But then you have some whites, huddling in the suburbs, and but then you also have Silicon Valley, and you'll have Apple Computer and Google and blah 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 all there, and then you'll have Cal Berkeley, a major research institution filled with Asians. It's just this kind of weird situation. And, at what point, what trumps what? I mean, does a $1 billion corporation, are they going to always be left untouched? Is Hispanic politics ever going to be like, well, give me all that stuff, thing? It's just a real question. I don't know the answer to it, but I don't know how long. In some ways, like the current arrangement's unsustainable.
Won't it just eventually become like a Latin American country with excessive levels of corruption?
Yeah. Right. I mean, it would be some weird thing where
enable them to hold everything together. The big corporations would bribe these Hispanic and Asian politicians to keep everything ticking along nicely, and the white middle class and small businesses would be the ones who would be squeezed.
I think you're right. I have this image of Google, and there's like a war zone outside, but Google has like Latin American style, militarized guards with barbed wire. But then once you get beyond the barbed wire, it's all these like silly gay whites and Asians like playing volleyball.
You're describing South Africa right now, Richard. I mean, that's
exactly, yeah. So maybe this horrible system is actually sustainable.
Yeah.
Or at least.
Well, yeah, I think world history teaches us that pretty grotesque systems are sustainable.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'll just throw this out there. I thought it was interesting. Ann Coulter, who, she is a provocative person. She's almost kind of like a comedian or something. She. In her performative persona, but she wrote an article which I'm sure you can find with an easily Googleable article called "Demography is Destiny," where she essentially paraphrased Peter Brimelow from the last 12 years. I mean, obviously without giving any credit. But, all these arguments are just each little paragraph.
That's what's going to happen to us.
Yeah. Each paragraph is like a VDARE argument that I've read 100 times because, I've read VDARE, So it's just kind of funny, though. I don't know. I mean, something's happening. It's worth.
Well, that's another example.
Yeah.
Although Ann Coulter, of course, has said a lot of provocative things in the past, but still, maybe this is kind of crossing a threshold in the same way that Pat Buchanan was creeping over the line with his comments.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let me throw this out here also. I recently signed a petition for Montana secession because it was...
Are you crazy? What's the economy going to be based on?
What are you talking about? Do you know the Montana state motto is gold and silver. We have tons of mineral resources, and we have tons of land. We can also... you can also come ski here. So
you can invite the Chinese in.
Yeah, well, we'll keep them at bay. But yeah, there are tons of resources here, and then the natural resources also include essentially tourist magnets. So we could have our own little Switzerland pretty easily. I think we could be quite very wealthy people. But we need very strict immigration policies to keep that going. But anyway, no, I thought actually when you said that, are you crazy? Because I was thinking that if you sign one of those presidential petitions, you're more or less putting your name on some list in the Pentagon where they're like, so...
Well, your name is probably already on their list, don't you think?
Yeah, that gives us a certain amount of leeway.
You're already a wanted man, so you might as well.
Well, they're like, these people don't threaten us now, but... if there's ever any kind of chaotic situation, a predator drone will be, sent to them.
That's why I don't have a mobile phone.
That's a good thing. Yes. So anyway, this is very interesting. That you had this burst of presidential petitions for secession, and you basically had it all across the red states, with maybe a few exceptions in there. But
and Oregon too.
Oh, in
Oregon and New York.
Interesting.
I guess those would be the two exceptions.
Yeah, and then there was a counter petition that we should, jail all those who signed the petitions, which is also kind of funny. So, I don't know. Is this coming to the mainstream? I've just noticed this from my parents because, my parents are for a long time they've been country club Republicans, like all good Episcopalians. But I've noticed even amongst, when I talk with them or when they've had friends over, when I've been up here at their house and they've had some friends over or something, I've noticed just a little more kind of like, well, the U.S. is going to break up. That was a more thinkable thought amongst hoity-toity types. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, see, it's the partition of the Sudan, which is sort of like taking the lid of this particular box.
What?
Last year, they decided to divide the Sudan into North Sudan and South Sudan.
Oh, okay.
And this was actually supported and encouraged by America. So once you do that, then the logic of that then follows. There's a lot of other people who are unhappily living together. Yeah. So why not do the same thing for them?
Oh, America's exceptional.
The American Revolution was a seceding from the empire in the first place.
Yeah.
So
the logic's always been there, lying latent for hundreds of years, and now it's ready to come out again.
Oh, I think so as well. I mean, there was talk about splitting Iraq into three, a Kurdistan and a Shia and a Sunni section.
Well, it actually has de facto split into three countries, hasn't it?
Without question. I mean, I think, but people would talk about this, they would talk about, these ethnicities can't get along. But we're talking about people who probably have more, one would think, more in common than, many blacks and Hispanics and whites and living in California together.
I mean, yeah, because California seceding doesn't actually make any sense, does it? But parts of California seceding does make sense.
Right, it would have to be.
The other problem is if you have secession and you just create lots of mini Americas, then you have the same problems happening again and again and requiring further and greater secession. So eventually you have a vast landmass made up of thousands of little countries, rather like the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, almost like principalities or something. It's interesting. I was thinking about just what you said when I read an article actually on VDare about Texas secession. And that struck me as essentially moving from the fire to the frying pan, or the frying pan to the fire. I forgot what the cliche is. It just did not make sense in the sense that if you, and this was written by someone, if they're writing for VDARE, they obviously have some kind of racial consciousness. You're moving from a situation in which you're 65% of the population to 45% of the population. I agree. I actually, as some people know, I grew up in Texas, and Texas has more of a national consciousness than probably any other state. I don't think of even people.
It was a country.
It was its own republic, for a while. I don't even think any kind of like real old stock American in Massachusetts that Massachusetts has a consciousness, even in these original colonies states. But that being said, I mean there are places that are thoroughly Mexicanized. I'm not saying that as like a dirty word or something, a slur. It's just reality. It's been Mexicanized. It is part of Mexico. Culturally and ethnically. So, I just don't think that makes sense. And I agree with also Colin that we need to almost solve this problem at the root. If we just break up, we're just going to have another, racially divided mass democracy, which seems bad. Although in some places it totally makes sense. I mean, Montana is just absurdly homogenous. I mean, it's just it's a Northern European people, and so I think in some ways we could create a kind of Switzerland here, a kind of laissez-faire republic. There's really no need for a really strong state outside of defense. In Montana, people take care of themselves. There's enough land to go around. I mean, you could have something very benign and quite attractive out here. But in Texas, I mean, good Lord, you all these white patriots might secede, and the next thing they know, they're, being dispossessed.
Back in Mexico,
yeah. I mean, it's a real funny situation. Go ahead.
Well, with this whole secession movement, if you want to call it that, I guess I have a hard time. I mean, I don't take it seriously in the sense that I don't actually think we're on the precipice of seeing states secede from the Union. But on the other hand, the fact that it's gotten this much momentum seems to say something. I remember after the 2004 election, when the liberals were all upset that George W. Bush had gotten reelected, and some of them were. Yeah. There was some talk. About secession. There were never any petitions signed, or that I can remember. Things never quite got to that point. But it seems like in an analogous period of time, where you have a reelection of a president who's loved by half of the country and hated by the other half.
Yeah.
As with George W. Bush, just flipped around the different halves. And yet in this case, it seems like the secession talk has really gone a lot farther and gotten a lot more attention than it did the other way around in 2004. And I don't know, maybe it's just because conservatives are more likely to think of this option of secession than liberals are, because of the the Civil War and the way that it's commonly thought of today.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm interested in hearing anyone's thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, do you want to pick up on that, Colin? I think I actually have a provocative question for both of you too.
You're mentioning how in America, in the last couple of presidents, Obama and Bush, have been very sort of divisive figures, and with one half of the country hating them and the other half loving them. Well, in Britain, we don't really have that problem with Her Majesty, the Queen, you see. So essentially, in a way, it's an argument for depoliticizing the head of state, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah,
the fact that you have this very politicized head of state and this very divided country, that's just going to lead to greater and greater instability and division. So the actual structure of the United States politically will enhance some of these divisive forces.
Well, I agree. It's a mass democracy where people really put so much into who the president is. It's a meaningful thing for them. And I actually, if you look back at a lot of the founders, there are many of them that a lot of them that thought of the president as a kind of monarchical figure, and one that is depoliticized in the sense of the word that you're using it there. But obviously with the rise of political parties, which came after the Constitution, that really changed. It's hard to even underestimate the kind of I was about to say it's hard to underestimate the kind of passion that so many people put into their presidents. But then I was just thinking, the majority of the population did not vote. Some 65% did not vote. If you look at some of these, things on the Jay Leno and things like that, they'll ask these normal Americans who the vice president is, and they think it's Michael J. Fox or something. Literally, they have no idea. So I don't know. It's a funny thing. Certainly, there is a large portion of the middle class and middle class white people who really this is very meaningful to them. And I don't know about blacks. I don't know if blacks would have rioted if Romney would have won. I almost say no to that question, but it's a question about the emotional impact. But let me ask you guys this. For a while now, Michael Hart, who is an interesting man, he's a scientist, and he's also a lot like the three of us here in his thinking. He takes race very seriously. Washington Summit Publishers have published a book of his, and we're going to do that again actually in 2013. So he's definitely on the same page as us. At the last Seattle conference that I organized, he actually gave a talk recommending the breakup of the United States, and he actually wanted to do it along red and blue states. And his talk was criticized by a lot of people there, and including myself. And I'm a little bit skeptical of that idea. But one interesting point of contention was whether the federal government would be willing to use violence to put down any kind of secession. And Michael Hart and also people like Jared Taylor, who's written about this also, they actually take the position that it's really just a matter of will on the part of a lot of patriots, that the federal government will not use force, that if they actually use force against people who are trying to peacefully secede, that it would be on the nightly news and people would freak out and so on and so forth. I actually maybe this says something about our different personalities. I take probably the exact opposite standpoint. I think the example of Lincoln and others, I just think that it would just be such a shock for this hyperpower, the world hyperpower, for it to actually decline in terms of its home base. I don't think they would allow that to happen, and I think So my position is that they would very much so be willing to use violence against people who are doing a serious secession. I don't think they're going to use any violence against someone who signed the petition. I wouldn't worry about that. But if it ever got serious, I think they would use violence. What do you guys say to that?
Apart from the instance you mentioned, which is the Civil War, America doesn't really have that much tradition of state repression. So this would be something which is much more typical of a European context.
Yeah.
And so maybe in the case of America, it would run into a lot more trouble because they just don't have the same kind of culture and tradition and history of state repression of rebellion.
Well, I don't know, though. Maybe this is a little passé now. Maybe this is kind of a 90s thing to be talking about. But just a few years ago, there with the Branch Davidians at Waco, and on a smaller scale, the what took place, up in your neck of the woods, Richard, in Idaho, with Richard Weaver.
Oh, yeah.
Those were both, heavily criticized incidences where federal forces moved in and did all kinds of what many believed to be atrocities, and were heavily criticized for it and took a beating for it. Do those images still linger in people's minds today? I'm just picturing if somebody tries to peacefully secede and then the government sends in troops, are they going to be talking about this is like Waco all over again, or has everybody forgotten about Waco now after 9/11 and all the things that have happened since the beginning of the new century.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, and I don't know the answer. The other thing, it's hard to answer the question because, the historical contingency, the historical context that these things would take place in has to be taken into account. I mean, maybe there's a point where we really have a collapse situation on our hands, hyperinflation, a world war, and there are multiple groups seceding, and the government just can't take it. I mean, there's certainly examples, the collapse of the Soviet Union being, the most recent, of a more or less peaceful dissolution. And so it's not that it's impossible. At the same time, if there was some fervently right-wing, popular secession group that was doing it right now, and they actually had a chance to secede, they had weapons, so on and so forth, I actually think the government would use force against them. I think they would be willing to do that.
Yeah, but would that actually work, though?
I mean, might blow up in their face, but it might not. It's very strange.
It might literally blow up in their face.
Right. Liberals kind of like authoritarianism in certain instances. I mean, they might be praising Obama, who killed these Nazis who are trying to take us back to the 1950s, or whatever thing they'll say. So I don't know. It's just a huge question, and I've always thought that you should always basically assume that your opponent is the greatest and the most ruthless person. If you're playing chess against someone, you shouldn't assume that they're bad. You should assume that they're the equivalent of Bobby Fischer or something. So
as long as it doesn't prevent you from fighting against them.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But, I don't think we should just be like, none of us are involved in secession, but, if there were, these types of movements, we should be like, oh, yeah, it's great, and we're peaceful, what are they going to do? I think we should be very, cognizant of history and probably a little cagey. So I would recommend that to people. I think it's very sad when, out in here in my neck of the woods, you see it in other places, where a lot of good-natured and actually well-intentioned people who are white, and they might have a libertarian bent to them, and they'll stockpile weapons and make pictures of themselves holding weapons and dressed in camo. And then invariably a week later, they're in jail of the FBI. So it's just, it's sad. I think people sometimes need to take this stuff really seriously and not make it easy for these
low profile.
stupid FBI agents. Yeah.